Joining us online is Bishop Robert Barron. He's Bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, Minnesota, and the founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. Through Word on Fire, Bishop Barron reaches millions of people every year. He's one of the world's most followed Catholics on social media. Bishop Barron, great to talk to you.
Ben, good to see you.
So let's talk a little bit about something that you've talked about a lot in recent years, and that is what you call the re-Judaizing of the church. What exactly does that mean? Because obviously there are fairly significant differences between Judaism and Christianity, but what do you mean by re-Judaizing the church?
Well, it's exceptionally important because the first Christians read Jesus thoroughly in light of what we call the Old Testament. If you try to interpret Jesus apart from the Old Testament, you'll get necessarily a distorted Jesus. So St. Paul is a good example. Rabbi Shaul, who becomes Paul the Apostle, and he says Jesus is the yes to all the promises made to Israel, which means you can't understand him apart from what's anticipated in Israel. When we de-Judaize Christianity, it turns into kind of a Gnostic philosophy. You see, by the way, a lot of that on display today. Whenever Jesus is presented as a kind of teacher of timeless moral truths, or he's like a great sage from the ancient world, you know you've misread him. He's the yes to all the promises made to Israel, and only against that background will you properly understand him.
So let's talk more formally about what exactly the distinction is between those two views of Jesus. One as not just God in the Catholic worldview, but also as a Jewish figure, as born as a Jew, lived as a Jew. What exactly would that mean, as opposed to the sort of thing that we've been told by the media, the sort of almost Buddha-esque figure who just is there to say pithy statements and then get out of your way?
Yeah, I would say, looking at the sweep of biblical history, you see a kind of 5-act drama, beginning with creation, followed by the fall, followed by the formation of a people, Israel, which is God's great rescue operation, God's attempt to restore his creation. And then we would say the great story of Israel culminates in the coming of the Anointed One, the coming of the new David, the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel. So that's the 4th act, is the coming of the Messiah. And then we would say, followed by a 5th act that we're in now until the very end of time, which is the era of the church. Now people being drawn more and more into what we call the mystical body of Christ. But see, Christ fits into that narrative. It's a Jewish narrative. It's a biblical narrative, from creation to fall to Israel to the Messiah. If you take him out of that, then you get this distorted, I would say at best mildly interesting Jesus. But the compelling Jesus is the one who fulfills the story of Israel.
So obviously we've seen this vast uptick in anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th, which is pretty astonishing given the fact that it was the largest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and much of the world has responded by hating Jews more as a result of that attack on Jews. Now, how should, number one, Christians understand that? And number two, you suggest that a better understanding of the New Testament is a curative towards some of the anti-Semitism that we're seeing right now.
I think it'll help. I mean, obviously, any form of anti-Semitism is morally repugnant. And, in recent years, the popes have been so good, let's say commencing with John Paul II, but even before him, go back to Pius XI, that we're all spiritually Semites, he said, in regard to Christians. So the popes have been really good and strong. Think of the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate is the document in question, that condemns any form of anti-Semitism. So that's a very important theme. But I think our point is when Christians realize how Jewish their own religion is, when they realize how Jewish their own scriptures are, that we can't understand Jesus apart from it, I think that helps. Because a Christianity which has become anti-Semitic is going to tear itself apart. And I'll go all the way back, Ben, to the 2nd century. This is a very old fight within Christianity. There was a figure called Marcion, who was a theologian based in Rome. And Marcion said, look, get rid of the Old Testament. It's testimony to a fallen God. Let's just keep a few parts of the New Testament that are most free of Jewish influence, and that's our religion. Well, the great Saint Irenaeus and then other early church figures said no to Marcion. And that was a decisively important move. But see, Marcionism is a very persistent heresy. Whenever today you hear people say, oh, I hate the God of the Old Testament. It's cruel and violent and all that. I like the God of Jesus, the New Testament. That's a neo-Marcionism. And the church in ancient times and now has always to say no to Marcionism, because we will miss Jesus if we go down that road.
So I want to talk now a little bit about Christmas more broadly and what it ought to mean to people.
Yeah.
So obviously it's been robbed of an enormous amount of meaning over the course of the last century or so, particularly in the United States. I mean, even Jews like me enjoy a lot of the cultural trappings of Christmas, but obviously for Christians, it's supposed to mean a lot more than it is for me as a Jew, where I just go get some Chinese food or something. I mean, it's been this,
Right.
It's turned into this commercialized version of what is a religious ritual. And it's very strange that has become the way that people think about Christmas, with arguments of whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie, as opposed to what the original meaning of Christianity was, what Christmas should be. So why don't you give me the Christian view of what Christmas should be? How should Christians act on Christmas? What should it look like?
Well, here's the first observation. I mean, you and I are going to disagree, obviously, about Jesus and how we read him. But I think we can and should find common ground in how to read the Christmas stories. The Christmas stories have to be read in a Jewish way. You open the first page of the New Testament, what do you find? Page 1 of the Gospel of Matthew. You find this lengthy, detailed genealogy of Jesus that takes you all the way through in a very loamy way, from Abraham all the way up to Jesus. Arranged, by the way, in 3 sets of 14 generations, from Abraham to David, David to the captivity to Jesus. Well, of course, the attentive Jewish reader is going to say 14. What's 14 but the number that corresponds to Dawid, to David? So Matthew is saying right away, this figure I'm going to tell you about is David, David, David. And he can only be understood through this long history of Israel. Look, for example, when the angel says to Mary that you will give birth to this child who'll be called Great, Son of the Most High, and he will reign on the throne of David, his father, and his reign will be without end. Well, what's that but the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy to David in 2 Samuel 7? Look at the Feast of the Presentation as part of the Christmas story, when the Lord is brought into the temple. Well, what's that but the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy, that the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord, had left the temple, but would come back at the time of the Messiah. So here's now, we would say, the glory of Yahweh returning to his temple. My point is, and we can go on and on with these, all the Christmas stories are richly Old Testament in their inspiration. They're meant to call to mind all these stories, so Jesus is properly situated. Even the massacre of the innocents, well, what does that call to mind? But at the time of Moses, when Pharaoh orders the death of all the male children. And then in the wake of the massacre of the innocents, Mary and Joseph bring Christ's child into Egypt. And then upon the death of Herod, he comes back from Egypt. What's that but a recapitulation of Israel under Joseph, going into Egypt, and then the Exodus coming out. Again, on and on we could go, but these are all the rich associations with the Old Testament. That's a way to approach the Christmas stories.
So, when we look at sort of the place of church in life, you and I have talked a lot about this in a wide variety of contexts, about how the decline of church in American life has been one of the great tragedies of our time in the last century and a half. But there is a revitalized church that is growing, and it is more traditionalist in orientation. It turns out that the Jesus that you're talking about, the Jesus that actually is connected to the Old Testament, is a lot more inspirational and interesting to people than the sort of paled out Jesus who is a speaker of progressive truths. It turns out that doesn't fill churches, because if you want that, you can go to a Democratic Party rally and wave a different flag. And it's not what people are actually going to go to church for.
No, precisely right. As you suggest correctly, why bother? But this goes all the way back to people like Friedrich Schleiermacher, early 19th century founder of liberal Protestantism, that tries to make Christianity accessible and agreeable to what he called its cultured despisers. And that's been the strategy of most forms of Christian liberalism from that time on, kind of going hat in hand to our cultured despisers and saying, we want to make our religion as acceptable to you as possible. The result of that is a very thinned out, uninteresting, blandly spiritual figure. But it's the richly biblical Christ, you're quite right, that's going to be compelling to people, always has been.
Well, folks, you can go check out Bishop Barron's work over at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. It's all fascinating stuff. Bishop Barron, it's always great to talk to you, and Merry Christmas.
God bless you. Thanks, man.